So we're working on the premise that your diocese has agreed to get behind the target to bring our emissions down to net zero by 2030. How are you going to do it? So we're starting way back at the beginning of the journey, and the premises of this session that you're going to need a dedicated group of people to lead and coordinate. And so we're going to think about some of the things that you'll need to think about in order to get that team going. So firstly, what is this team going to have to do? I think its first job will be to motivate, to bring all parts of the church in your diocese along on the journey, to spread enthusiasm, to gain trust, encourage participation, and to make the case that this really is important, that it's relevant, that it's theologically sound, and that it's an essential part of our discipleship. The group's going to have a much more practical focus for monitoring or measuring. It will be the central keeper of the data about our energy use, our travel, any renewable energy schemes, if we're going to be doing any offsets across churches or schools or home, land, whatever might be going on. And it will have to make things happen. This group won't do everything, but it will certainly be the catalyst for things that individual churches or schools can't make happen on their own. It'll be things like setting the policy, sharing good practice, and supporting fundraising. I was so pleased with my little 3 M's, I came up with another 3 E's. So the group will need to engage, enumerate, and enact. So where are you starting from? We're not all quite in the same position. Do you have a group in existence already? Most, but not all dioceses do have an environment working group, and the diocesan environment officer is usually part of that group and often chairs it, but not always. So it might be that this is the group that can or should take the net zero journey forward. Or maybe this group isn't quite the right one that you need, or it's going to need extra support to take on this journey. Maybe it will need more members or other support such as admin or finance. So basically we'll start with that group and then add more. Or maybe you feel that this is not the right group for this journey to net zero and you'll need to form a new one. Or maybe you don't have a group at all and so you'll need to form a new one. It's very useful at the beginning to set out your terms of reference for your either for your environment working group or for your net zero group. Lots of groups already have terms of reference and they set out things like the purpose of the group, the membership of the group, relationships of the group into the diocese, issues of money and meetings. And so here are a few ideas which I've drawn from a range of dioceses around the country. The purposes include things like doing the theological thinking for the diocese, or at least some of the resource finding, raising awareness of or raising the profile of environmental issues, integrating creation care into the life, mission and ministry of the diocese, responding to and promoting national initiatives, building local and national partnerships, producing, reviewing and implementing environmental policy, briefing or advice to the bishop, leading on and running environmental projects, linking up environmental issues with issues of justice and mission. So these were all in the terms of reference that I've gathered from Blackburn, Lincoln and Coventry. So there's quite a lot there, and we've added now taking the diocese to net zero carbon emissions. Other things to think about when you're setting out your terms are who should be on the group, how often it meets, and who it reports back to. And we'll come back to some of those things as we go along. So are you going to need 1 or 2 groups? That's a question for today which you'll need to answer depending on your context, to say whether your existing group should continue with all the things it was doing before and the net zero target, or whether you'll need an additional group. So this group could be like a task force or a subgroup which will focus on net zero while the other group keeps working on its other purposes. Or it might be more of a super group which focuses on the strategic thinking and planning and policy making, and the existing group that you have is more operational. So that would be, you'd have your regular environment group and then an additional one. Yeah, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Yeah, so first of all, maybe your group will do both, Maybe you'll have 2 groups, or maybe the environment group will focus on the net zero planning and all the other stuff will be put to one side and you'll come back to it later, or if you have any time. So that's you'll have to weigh up what works in your own environment. So for Oxford Diocese, they already had an environment group with quite a wide-ranging remit for things to do, and they felt they needed to have a task force which would focus on the net zero action. But you might find in a smaller diocese, you just don't have the people to staff 2 groups working on this kind of thing. So you might need to just decide that one group will do everything, or some of the things that you were doing will have to be put to one side. Whatever works in your context, really. So today, rather than thinking about the whole range of things that your group might be working on, we're just going to focus really on the group that's journeying to net zero and think about who needs to be in that group and where do you fit within diocesan structures. Who do you need in your group? I think it's helpful to think in 3 ways about who will be a good people in your team. So up, in and out, and we'll start with up. And in this case, I'm really thinking about the senior leadership in your diocese. So it's really useful and important to have a representation from the senior leadership on your team. This person will set the tone and the direction for the whole diocese, and this person will have access to the money, or at least the decisions about the money. It will be somebody who other people will listen to when they say that things need to be done, and ideally it would be the bishop. And if not the diocesan bishop, then someone who they have tasked or handed over the responsibility to take the lead on, so that even if it's not the diocesan bishop themselves, they have given over that responsibility specifically. And it's quite tricky, I think. We all recognise that the senior team in our diocese are very busy, but I think it's really important that we try to make it happen, because it shows that the diocese is serious about the environment and about reaching net zero, and that everyone else in the diocese should take it seriously too. It gives you direct access to the decision-making and spending body, so that the plans that you make can be acted on straight away without extra layers of process to get things done. And it creates the opportunity for the environment to be part of the whole diocesan decision-making and strategy and thinking. Because in the long run, we're not looking for an environmental policy, but for every policy to be environmental. A green thread, somebody said the other day, which I really like that idea. So at this point, I don't want to assume that everyone knows everything about how a diocese is set up. So it would be useful to look at who tends to make up the bishop's staff and who might be useful on your team. So you'll have the bishops, the diocesan plus the suffragan bishops or area bishops, depending on how your diocese works. You'll have archdeacons. There'll be the cathedral dean, the diocesan secretary, who is the senior layperson in a diocese, a bit like the CEO. Then there's the diocesan advisory committee, who they're advising about things that changes in buildings, and they don't usually sit on the staff team, but they are very handy to have on your environmental working group. The diocesan director of education is usually part of the bishop's staff team, and the diocesan comms officer, all very useful people. And at this point, I wanted to show you this diagram here as a way of thinking about the movers and shakers in a diocese, really. So you'll have people in your diocese who are not very keen on this whole process. Either they're not interested in the environment, or they think that the net zero target is just not possible. And then there'll be people, everyone who's on this call, who's really positive and excited about the challenge that lies ahead and the prophetic vision that this gives us as a church. Then there'll be people around who have less power or influence in the diocese, and those who have more power and influence in the diocese. And so you end up with, in each quadrant, different people have different sort of functions, if you like, without not wanting to reduce people to function. But anyway, so in this quadrant here, people don't have so much power, but they're positive about the process and the topic, are often the doers. They'll get things done, but they don't have a great deal of influence. Whereas the people over here on the right-hand side at the top will be your champions. They are the ones who can move things forward and change hearts and minds. So in a diocese, if you've got someone who has the power to encourage people to move forward and change things, who is keen and on your side, they are the people that you want on your team, the champions. Because although we have people here who might be negative, if they don't have so much power, they will be hard to convince, but you won't necessarily have very much to gain by convincing them. Whereas the people at the bottom right down here, who are negative and do have influence, have the potential to derail the whole process. And quite often what you have in a diocese, or in any team really, you will have people who are really keen but not much power trying to influence the people who are very unkeen and do have power. So you're influencing across the middle, and that doesn't usually work. The people over here at the bottom are usually influenced by the people in the box above them, and that's where you need to have your champions on side to have influence over, influence over those in the bottom quadrant there. So and this is where somebody in that senior leadership team needs to be your champion on your side, helping to move things forward. I understand that it's not always easy to get the senior support that you need, but in your armoury you do have the London Truro General Synod motion, which called for every diocese to identify a lead for the environment from their senior leadership team. So you should have a named person, and you can go back to that to ask for one. And ideally that person will come to your meetings, but if they can't or won't, then maybe you can get them to agree to come to some of them, or agree to receive the minutes and you catch up with them in a shorter meeting but a regular one. Or maybe you can establish a mechanism so that what your group does feeds directly into senior leadership team meetings. Because at the very least, you would hope that your bishop is looking for some accountability from his or her environment team. Okay, so that was up. And now we're going to think about in and the representation that we need from all parts of the church. You will need plenty of people on your team, and the expertise you need will depend to some extent on how wide your remit is, whether it's just net zero or the whole range of things that you might expect an environment working group to tackle. But one thing I want to say at this point is that the General Synod motion did call for all parts of the Church of England to reduce emissions. So I'm just going to show you this diagram, which is a little bit old now, but it shows us the percentage of total carbon emissions by a building type. This is based on energy usage rather than a whole range of other things. But you can see that churches make up a lot less than half of our carbon footprint. So churches, and even including church halls, is this deep yellow, green, orange and light blue. The biggest chunk you can see is the schools, primary, middle schools and secondary schools. But you can also see that cathedrals make a significant impact, offices a small impact, and clergy houses as well. So with that in mind, if we're going to have an impact across all areas of the church, then it'll be good to have people from each of these areas represented in your team. So that's thinking about the expertise that we can get from within the church, within the diocese. You will have your faithful environmental champions on the group, and they will have the passion and commitment to keep things going, even when things are tough. But you're going to need a few more people than that. It's a very practical task, and what needs to happen relates significantly to our buildings. And so therefore someone from the DAC is very useful, and perhaps their sustainable heating advisor too. So we're going to need somebody from education to reach across all parts of the Church of England, someone from the cathedral, someone from the glebe committee, someone, or the property and finance committee, or however that works in your team. It might also be in your remit to bring a theological perspective. So who could do that for you? Who could bring a social justice perspective or a global perspective? This area is going to be probably very important in taking the message out beyond the centre, out and beyond your keen supporters, to bring on board all the parishes in the diocese. And I'm going to come back to this, but as we mentioned at the beginning, one of the tasks of the group to motivate or engage. So it's worth thinking who on your team can do that. So here is a bit of a summary of all the people who could contribute to your working group or your task group. Environment enthusiasts, the DAC, education, finance, property, land, glebe, maybe the diocesan surveyor, someone from the cathedral, someone with a justice, social affairs, world mission remit, someone from your comms team, maybe someone with a theological perspective. Okay, so that's in, and then out. Expertise from without. Look beyond the church. You might already have noticed, as you've been looking around your team, that there's an area that you need expertise from and you don't have it within your church circle. Maybe that DAC heating advisor is brilliant, but just not great on renewable systems. But also to think wider than this. There are things that are happening in the wider society that will make our job easier or harder. So, for example, as our grid decarbonises and is less and less dependent on fossil fuel, then our footprint will go down. There are lots of other people in society who've made their own commitments to reach net zero, and they've got different timescales, but it's worth looking at who else is working on this target. This might be true of local councils, local businesses, the police, universities. If that's the case and they've made statements to this effect, it's worth reaching out to them and seeing where you can work together to bring mutual benefit. So Guildford Diocese are connecting with their local council, which has also set a net zero target, and Bristol and Birmingham are also doing the same, I think. And Bristol also have contact with their local, well, the local branch of an international civil engineering company who are helping them to think about their own carbon footprint. So you'll have different people around you in your diocese who you can reach out to, depending on your context. Okay, then one more thought about this group. You don't want to stuff your meetings so full of people that you can never make any decisions. So I did a quick internet search about the optimum size of a decision-making body, and the answer came back around 7. And I've come up with way, way more than 7 people that you might have on your team. So it's interesting to think about the dynamic here. If you're looking for a space where you can develop ideas and put out creative thoughts, then more people is helpful. And also you'll need to manage the issue of staying quorate. Often you'll find people get busy and they can't come to every meeting. So if you start with a small group, it might just disappear. But on the other hand, you might decide that a smaller group will make some of the core decisions, and the other people that you've connected with will be available to advise and support you as and when you need that, and they won't necessarily be part of every meeting every time. So that's again, I'm just full of questions rather than answers today, but that's a question that you'll need to grapple with and decide who's part of that core decision-making team and who are the experts that you reach out to. You know, there'll be people who want to help you, but you won't necessarily have them come to every meeting. And then just anchor it in real life. These are, Catherine found these on the internet last week. This is the working group in Salisbury. They've got the Diocesan Environment Officer, the Assistant Diocesan Secretary, the Social Justice Manager, 2 members of the clergy, a representative from A Rocha, the Cathedral Treasurer, and an Archdeacon. So they're obviously lucky to have someone in their diocese with strong connections with A Rocha. Won't all necessarily have that, but it would be really interesting for them to think about having someone from an education team on their group. Oops, why has that happened? And then this is from Southwark Diocese. They've got a lead bishop on the environment on their team. They've got their diocesan environment officer, and then it's a big diocese and they organise it by area. So they've got area bishops rather than suffragan bishops. So they've got an environment advisor in each area, and they sit on the working group too. They've got a member of the clergy, someone from the DAC, and then someone who is the coordinator of the Justice, Peace and Integrity of Creation group. Yeah, so they've got a DAC chair on this group, and that's really interesting. But again, they don't have someone from education. And I think that's a bit of a new, we haven't really thought about education so much before, but as we've put in our motion that we are to reach all parts, then we're suddenly starting to realise we need to talk to our schools more. So where does all this fit into diocesan structures? I've alluded to this a little bit already, talking about accountability. I think we've gone beyond the stage where an environment working group is a special interest group or sits on the side. If we're serious about reaching net zero, this group has to be integrated into diocesan structures, and it's part of, or at least able to influence decision making and strategy. And that's why that link into the senior leadership team is vital. So some of the questions to be thought about. who sets the agenda for this group? So you've got the overriding broad agenda, the remit and direction of what the group needs to achieve, and then the specific agenda for each meeting, and they probably won't be set by the same person. I also think this needs to be a two-way process. The people on the group will be closer to the issue, they'll understand what needs to be done, and they'll have the expertise. So it would be frustrating for them not to have any agency about the strategy and direction, but equally frustrating not to have any direction from the top or any sense of ownership within the life of the diocese. Who is the group accountable to? Who do you report back to? Or if you like, who gets shirty if the group's not doing what they should? Will anyone even notice? If your diocese has agreed a synod mission to recognise the climate emergency and cut emissions to net zero by 2030, then you have some accountability there, and there's a good reporting structure as well. And then how do you communicate to the rest of the diocese so that schools and parishes and the cathedral and everyone else knows what will be asked of them? This is going to mean good links to your comms team. And they will be involved in sharing the decisions that you've made, but also sharing good practice and best practice and good news so that people are encouraged and motivated. Also, your communication to the rest of the diocese will be facilitated by the people on your team who represent the different parts of the church, so the cathedral and schools and things like that. I also, for a while in Sheffield, had someone on my team who was a retired vicar, and he offered himself to preach about the environment across the diocese. He said to the area deans, I'll cover your vacancies on a Sunday morning, but I have to speak about the environment, take it or leave it. So that was really great for the while. But even as such a brilliant resource that was, he can only stretch himself so far. So thinking about bringing everyone on the journey, it's worth thinking again about those 4 quadrants, but in a slightly different context now. When it comes to parishes, who are the doers who get on with things, but who are the champions who will really motivate and encourage the parishes, and who might derail what we're trying to do? And they might be slightly different people than those who operate at diocesan level. I think that direction and leadership from the top goes a long way. Hang on. But there may be more that you need to do to encourage or motivate and engage people. So one of the best tools that we found for doing that sort of engagement process is Eco-Church and Eco-Diocese, which is run by a Rocha. It's an holistic approach which encourages churches to bring creation care into its work and teaching, into the care of its buildings and land, into its community engagement, and into the lifestyle of its congregation. It's not explicitly related to the net zero target, but the biggest benefit is that it links all of our work in this area to our whole ministry and discipleship. When we focus on the target, we can tend to get rather technical, and it doesn't engage us spiritually necessarily. So I would definitely commend Eco-Church and Eco-Diocese to you, although at the moment, Rocha are going through the same issues that all of us are going through, and some of their staff have been furloughed. So you can find out all the information on their website at the moment, but you can't register any new churches just for the time being. And then the other thing to remember is that the 5th mark of mission is part of our mission. We are here as a church. Part of our mission is to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and to sustain and renew the life of the earth. One of the things that you might want to do is to, I've gone forward too quickly. Identify a champion in each deanery, or maybe in each parish, who you will be able to link up with, and they will do that hearts and minds job for you. They won't necessarily be sitting on your group, but they will be your link out into the parishes. So I hope you found this as a helpful place to start thinking about your net zero team. We've got some time for questions and answers, and we are also running some more sessions on the following topics: the vision of a net zero carbon church, putting action planning to reach your net zero target, and defining and measuring net zero.